the course, I've mentioned two of Stacey Hunter's studies. I talked a little bit about the big chart that you guys have with the acute metabolic response and the cardiovascular response and the thermal response. And I talk a little bit about how it's so great now that we have it charted, where it's like, oh, the internal body temperature actually is increasing over 98.6 degrees, and it takes about 45 minutes, and then we hit triangle pose, and there it plateaus. And we all know that walking into that room and starting this class is going to shift homeostasis, and the body's going to continue to try to struggle to reclaim that homeostasis, to return to those homeostatic levels. But until you guys put together this chart, it really wasn't quantified in any tangible way. So first of all, thank you for that. The work that you guys are doing is incredible, and in such need. We need this so desperately.
Cool. Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about that study. It was, we looked at that, the biggest question that people had was, how many calories do you burn in a yoga class?
Of course, that's always the top priority on people's minds.
Right, and so the thing I can tell you unequivocally is just don't believe what you read on the internet. You're not burning 1,000 calories. You're not burning 1,500 calories.
Yeah.
You're not burning anywhere near that many calories.
I remember when you guys came to New York for the symposium, what you called it, Yoga Science Symposium,
Yes.
I think, in 2014, how everyone in the room was like, wait, it's the equivalent of taking a long walk, a 20-minute walk, or whatever, in terms of caloric expenditure.
Caloric expenditure for the men in the study averaged 469 calories in a 90-minute session.
Yeah.
And that's a far cry from the claims of 1,000
Right.
or 900. Now, you might feel like you've burned that many calories, but indeed, when you really think through how much muscular engagement you're using throughout the class and how much it takes, and if you've ever experienced taking a class, a 90-minute class, in regular room temperature, you would understand that you are not using as much muscular activity as you think you are.
Yeah.
And actually in yoga postures and hatha yoga postures, our idea is it's isometric holds.
Yes. Good. Thank you for tying that in. That's one of the vocabulary terms. Remember, isometric muscle contraction is one of the
Yes.
three types.
So we are not really expecting ourselves to burn a lot of energy. Actually, we really want to slow our breath down and burn less. Okay, so the feeling that you get is actually your perceived metabolic rate. And so what happens in the course of a class in a high temperature environment, what people experience is their heart rate climbing as a result of our body's natural thermodynamic response, our metabolic response to heat. And so our bodies are like a radiator, and we are radiating heat. So we need to bring all of our blood vessels will dilate in a hot room like that.
Yep.
And so blood is going everywhere. So the great benefit is our circulatory system. It is benefiting profusely. And so our heart has to keep up by feeding the brain. Our brain is deprived of glucose in such a scenario. So, but the brain can't shut off. It can't say, I'll take a time out.
Of course.
So it says, heart, work harder. Keep feeding me glucose and oxygen. So that's kind of the head fake.
And I love that too, because another layer on top of that is, of course, the vasodilation will trigger the heart rate to increase.
Yes.
Simply by walking into the heated environment. But then when we start to demand glucose to the large muscle groups, that's going to increase the heart rate even further.
Absolutely.
I love that there's a distinction between increased heart rate demand under thermoneutral exercise, and then the combination of that with the vasodilation from the heat, how those two interplay. I love that.
Absolutely. So getting back to the calories, so for women, the average in this study was 333 calories. And so that might sound disappointing
It
to
was
a lot of people.
in the room that day during the symposium. Everyone was like, "Wait, what? Is that a typo? Is that she means 1,200, not 200?"
So 333. But what I would suggest, and what I think what most people practicing hot yoga for a long period of time realize is that you think of your body as a car, and your car runs on gasoline. That's the food that you give it. But also, the car needs to be tuned up. You need to have the oil changed. You need to have the radiator flushed.
Sure.
Okay? And so those are the things that we are doing in a hot yoga class. By the help of the circulatory system and the respiratory system, we are tuning up the car. We're tuning up the body and the mind, of course, but we're flushing all these things out through the respiratory system and the circulatory system, that our body is able to run much more efficiently, much more effectively. We probably experience other lifestyle changes that compound their effects. And so people come out more radiant. They feel like maybe they've lost weight, and they're thinking, wow, it must be the calories I burned in that class. But maybe it's you're actually tuning up your body in a different way. So, and recharging it, it's running more efficiently. It burns the fuel better. You get better gas mileage, right, out of the food that you eat. So there's many, it's a multi-dimensional cause and effect, if you say.
You mentioned that people notice one of the results of practicing under heated conditions is weight loss.
Yes.
And that's something that Dr. Stacey Hunter, detailed in her endothelial study as well.
Correct. Many things on that chart. First off, we talked about the calories, water consumption, and water loss. So that was also measured.
Cool.
And how much they were very scientific. They weighed people before and after with their water bottle.
Oh.
Okay. So they understood how much they were bringing into the class.
Got it.
And then how much they ended the class with, both with and without their water bottle, so they can understand. Also, they see how much water they drank, but also how much water loss that they came out of them.
Sure,
and
that's so smart. Yeah.
Of course, and so of course the men who were larger overall in the study, consumed more water, sweated out more water. So nothing surprising there. Again, going back to the perceived metabolic rate. Okay, so metabolic rate is measured in MET, metabolic equivalence. Okay, a metabolic equivalent of 1 is at body at rest.
Cool.
A metabolic equivalent above 3.0, or 3 times a body at rest, is moderate exercise. Above 4 or 5, I believe, you can check my quote here, is vigorous exercise. Okay, so above 3 is moderate, and overall for the hot yoga class, 90-minute hot yoga class, the MET's equivalent came out to 3.1.
Okay.
So it was deemed to be moderate exercise.
Moderate, sure.
Now, part of the study was to ask the participant by show of fingers at various points in time in the class, what is the perceived exercise intensity, okay? And they would rate it from, 1 to 10.
10, yeah.
Okay? And so clearly in the standing series, you found a more perceived, intensity. And also the caloric expenditure also indicated that there was a higher metabolic rate. And so the METs during the standing series exceeded 4.0. So, yes,
so it did, okay.
It did. Now the METs.
Are you saying it's an average of 3.5
Yes,
or whatever? Okay,
3.1 was
got
the
it.
average.
Average
Yes.
over the whole,
Over the whole
course of
90
the 90 minutes. Got it.
So the first 50 minutes exceeded 4, and of course, as you can tell, as you would suppose, that the floor series was below 3, it was in the 2. So we averaged out to 3.1. So the standing series is quite vigorous. And so that chart, as a yoga teacher or a prospective yoga teacher, or just as an interested student, tells you everything about a 90-minute session.
Yeah.
From that one chart, you see calories, you see expenditure, you see heart rate, but most importantly, you see core body temperature.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Which is what I described in when I introduced the study. Getting a true, accurate reading of core temperature, which over the and tracking it over the course of the 90 minutes and being able to plot points and determine at what points in class, during what postures, these metrics are being read. I'm interested in, you mentioned that the MET rating is 1 at rest, and the average over the course is 3.1 for the entire class, but you said up to 4?
4.5, I believe, on the
4.5?
standing, 2.5 roughly on the floor.
In the chart, and we'll take a closer look at the chart once I get a hold of it. Are you able to see the MET plotted like during Savasana in the floor series, and then when you go into the posture itself? What? Because I'm interested in how effective this is at improving recovery heart rate. How much does the heart rate actually spike and fall? We hold a Savasana in the floor series for 20 seconds. Does that give us a true opportunity to bring it down low enough to, let's say, the MET of 1 or back to close to 72 beats per minute?
I believe that you can interpret that through the chart with there are 2 plots that measure the heart rate.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I think what you're referring to is sometimes heart rate variability, right? So you can see the heart rate climbing and going up and down, but remember the measurement points are, I think, maybe about 15 seconds apart. So it's not like this constant thing. So there are measurement points. But they do follow very closely with the metabolic expenditure. And the metabolic expenditure is measured by expired CO2 gas.
Right.
Okay, so that is the gold standard way of measuring how many calories you are burning. It's by knowing how much CO2 you're expiring, and that is indicating how much energy you're using, how much ATP you're using in your muscles. Okay, so that is the best way to do it. So you'll see heart rate and metabolic rate naturally go hand in hand. You will also see that in Savasana, when you take that first long 2-minute Savasana after you've worked your heart rate up, and then you go to Savasana right around the toe stand and the tree pose and toe stand, and then back to Savasana, you see a nice big drop down in the metabolic rate. And then we start to have our little peaks and valleys around the spine strengthening series and camel pose, some of the back bended postures. And one of the things you should also know about one of Dr. Hunter's earlier studies was looking at blood pressure, systolic and diastolic blood pressure during yoga postures. So indirectly answering your question about what do yoga postures do to kind of create this heart rate variability and our ability to go from very high blood pressure to very low blood pressure. So this study is very, very interesting. This is one of the studies that got Dr. Hunter on this yoga study path. As an example, what she found was that awkward pose or chair pose elevated our systolic blood pressure to very high levels, just below 200. And for postures like locust pose or camel pose, over 200 systolic blood pressure.
Wow. And remember, the systolic that should be at roughly 120 millimeters of mercury.
Yes. So what she found was, in her initial hypothesis, was that yoga practice was not good for the heart. Because what you would find, that elevated blood pressure is often found in strength training.
Okay.
Weightlifting. If you're pressing a barbell away, there's a lot of that type of anaerobic strength creates quite a bit of stress on your heart, and your blood pressure elevates way high. And versus runners who find aerobic exercise does not have that similar effect. And what a lot of cardiovascular researchers found was that aerobic exercise like running compared to strength training, very heavy weightlifting, had different effects on the heart and cardiovascular system. So her initial thesis was that yoga would not be good for the heart because she found these particular points where she's like, that's not a safe level of blood pressure.
Right.
But what we have to understand too is that we are using our natural body weight, and we are doing postures that are the human body is capable of doing, and we are exercising the posture, performing it for 10, 20, 30 seconds, and then we go into Savasana. So this is an indirect answer to your original question.
Very cool. So what you're saying is her initial findings were that this type of exercise, and I'm so surprised that the systolic results were closer to anaerobic exercise, especially when we put such an emphasis on breathing, yes. Constant, steady breathing. And so, but what you're saying, I think what you're about to get to is that it's the combination of the two.
Yes.
Do you know, in that particular study, off the top of your head, do you know what the systolic dropped to, let's say, during Savasana? If 200 is too much, and it
yes.
could be detrimental.
Yeah.
Do you okay?
No, they don't. All they did was take blood pressure of a yoga practitioner who happened to be a hot yoga practitioner,
right.
Because that's who she had availability,
Sure.
access to. Hooked her up and said, let's do some postures and let's measure what happens to your blood pressure.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like just what kind of got her on that trail. Those are the first few crumbs.
Very cool.
On the trail.
Yeah.
Then that effect, when you think of it, where you're pushing the boundaries and pushing beyond the boundaries of what is perceived to be normal, okay, blood pressure wise, systolic, 220, 210, 220 systolic is a high number.
Yeah.
Okay? But when it comes back, there's a term for this, and we'll talk about Dr. Raison in a moment when we can. Hormetic effect. Okay? Where what you do is it's like a vaccine, or it's like you got to give a little dose of the medicine
Right.
to put things under control. So you have to hit it hard, okay? And so, but when it springs back, okay, so when your heart, your cardiovascular system is stressed to that level, but it springs back and it's able to withstand that, okay? So the idea is you gotta create this short-term stress, which is going to create some cascade of biochemical reactions, but it's just for a measured period of time, and it springs back into a much stronger homeostatic level.
Yeah.
So that idea is core to one of his other thesis, which is about heat, which is also part of that chart. Internal body heat.
Yeah.
So internal core temperature. Internal core temperature, how did they measure that? There was a horse pill with a radio RF thermometer.
It was RF. Okay,
RF.
I knew it was wireless of some sort. I didn't know the
Yes.
technology.
An RF device. They swallowed it 2 hours before the class. So it worked its way down into the small intestine.
Yeah, probably.
Maybe large intestine at that point.
Probably
who knows?
small, I
Small
guess.
intestine. And so they could communicate with this RF device.
Yeah.
So actually the best measure of actual internal core temperature, a least invasive method. So, and they took the readings throughout the class, and what they found was, and this will help address potential safety concerns that people have with hot yoga.
Yeah.
The idea that a room is heated to 105 or more does not necessarily mean that your body is heated up to 105.
Right.
Okay? So it's like you're cooking a turkey or tofurkey, whatever, as you
Thank you,
choose.
Chef.
So the core temperature was observed to elevate several degrees.
Was it 101 roughly? Is that that? Yeah.
101.6, I believe,
Okay.
was the average,
Okay.
the mean. But as a mean, you wonder, well, how high did it go? There were some observations 103 plus, and others that were far less.
Yeah.
The mean was 101.6. Now, each person has their own ability to thermal regulate. Okay? That is actually one of the most amazing things about the human body. And so the same idea, this hormetic effect, if you sit around in an air-conditioned room, an air-conditioned car, an air-conditioned home, restaurant, grocery store,
Hours and hours of
and
your
hours.
day. Yeah.
Being comfortable is probably one of the leading causes of all of our diseases.
Because we then lose the ability to regulate it? Is that the point?
That's the
Wow,
point.
Wow.
So Dr. Charles Raison is one of the leading researchers on the body's ability to thermal regulate and the effect of heat on the body and heat therapy. So think again. We heat up the body and push the boundaries. So when do we ever voluntarily introduce a core temperature of above 101? Some intense exercise, right? Maybe aerobic exercise, okay? Or a hot yoga class,
Yeah.
right? If you can go above 101, and Dr. Raison found a very specific point, 101.3 degrees. Okay? 101.3 degrees, certain cascade of magic happens in the body, right? And the effect of heat on the skin triggers an air conditioner effect deep in the brain. And that same area in the brain also triggers serotonin production. So there have been many studies, and he's a psychiatrist who works with many people on depression. And so the idea that heat on the skin triggers a response in the brain that gives us euphoric feeling. And so I think that's what explains a lot of the feeling, the afterglow from a hot yoga class.
Yeah, for sure. We talk about in the course how the hypothalamus responds to increased external temperature with perspiration, with the sweat response. But I did not know there was a serotonin correlation there as well. It's
Yes.
very cool. And it makes so much sense.
And it makes sense.
And so to bring it back to something you said earlier, be wary of what you read online, and and that's really bringing it back to this point that I want to hammer home, is there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of it is either like just self-serving. I remember back to that moment in 2014 when Dr. Stacey Hunter was saying, this is the equivalent. It has the equivalent caloric expenditure of a 20-minute walk, and everyone's like, "What? But what?" And it's like, "No, don't tell anybody that." But I love what and how would you say it? So, Pure Action funds these studies or facilitates them. What's the proper terminology? What do you do? What do you and Marty do with Pure Action that gets these studies accomplished?
Okay, so when we started Pure Action in 2010, it was on the tail end of us sponsoring this one study with Dr. Hunter's lab on cardiovascular research. And we didn't fund anything there. It was funded by the university. But what we were fascinated by was that there was this researcher interested in studying yoga. And hot yoga in particular, because it's the same sequence, same conditions, similar instruction for the most part.
Right.
And so it's a very well controlled for randomized controlled trials, RCTs. And at that time, in 2010, if you Googled PubMed and you searched PubMed for yoga and RCT, you would find very few.
Nothing.
Okay? Many you would find in India. Okay. Now, in India, the practice of yoga research and yoga science was yoga. We're going to apply yoga to this problem. Now, yoga, what we apply can be a whole different sequence based on each individual person's needs.
Right.
Okay, so it is not like here's a yoga class of the same system with the same. The idea of a yoga class is very foreign to people in India.
Right, right.
So it's a Western invention, really. So what we tried to do then was study the effect of this yoga class. And so this yoga class is a system, so it's easy to study. So we then started to realize that there was a gap in literature and research. So we attempted to raise money for these pilot studies. So you have to do a pilot study. You create a couple of tests and you prove the concept and you do some pilot studies which then lead to larger grants. Okay, so at the time, for the first maybe 4 or 5 years of Pure Action, we were looking for different projects. It was really out of curiosity more than anything else to try to understand what could be done.
Sure.
But really over the last 5 years, there's a lot being done. So really we've stepped away from the funding and plus the economic landscape of this. And we've really shifted our focus towards community. And being able to take such results from studies and rather than fund them, and there's many great people doing all kinds of research. And I think it's pretty widely acknowledged that yoga is good for the health, good for the mind-body, equation. I don't think we need a lot more proof that it works. What I believe we need more of is outreach and bringing yoga to underserved communities and using the research that is out there and the good research of others to promote yoga and demystify it and bring it to people who could potentially need it most. People with metabolic syndrome, high risk for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, depression, and all other mental challenges, let's say.
And that's an arm of Pure Action that I haven't mentioned at all in the anatomy course. I was just focusing mostly on the importance of getting some good clinical research, but yeah, obviously you're doing that as well in a very impactful way. You mentioned the body is like a car. You need to fuel it. You need to get the oil changes, and that's what this yoga accomplishes essentially, metaphorically. I'm interested to know, what would be your process of figuring out things that you can say in class that you feel confident are objective and justified?
That's a great question. I would recommend that everybody look for Dr. Charles Raison.
Okay.
Watch one of his TED Talks from 2013, I believe. And also find some of his more recent podcasts or his recent stuff out there on YouTube. Because his kind of lectures I can listen to over and over again, and each time pick up one more little nugget of information.
I think, and thank you for providing that source for us. I think that's the important thing. Not necessarily picking up nuggets from your fellow yoga teachers.
Yes.
Because you don't know where they picked up that nugget, but getting to the source of people who are in the research field and actually do have quantitative data on these claims.
Yes. So let me, one thing I do like to talk about in a class is the idea of the core body temperature being elevated to 101.3 degrees Fahrenheit roughly, and triggers this cascade of biochemical reactions that increases serotonin production in the brain. This has been shown and researched, and you can find that on PubMed. Okay? There's a lot of literature on PubMed on sauna therapy, heat therapy.
Right.
So other therapies that are heat-oriented therapies, okay, that elevate core body temperature. Imagine sitting in a dry sauna for 15 minutes. Do you know how high your internal core temperature gets? Quite high. And
Does it exceed the 101?
yes, it does.
Interesting.
And what that does is actually, if you sauna therapy, a study, 3 dry saunas a week for 15 minutes in 2 weeks found a reduction in fasting glucose level. So it is often seen as a treatment for type 2 diabetes.
Wow. Wow.
So you can perhaps sit in a dry sauna for 15 minutes at a time, 3 times a week, or you can go into a hot yoga room for 90 minutes, 3 times a week, and think about the compounded effects that you have. I'd rather choose the hot yoga room, right? And the heat lamp. Okay, so this was the other study. This is the main study that really triggered Dr. Rayson on to all of this research. It was a heat study for depression. In Sweden or Finland, heat therapy is very common.
Yeah. All the Scandinavian.
All the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah.
So they heated the body in under a heat lamp. Okay, took them about 100 minutes to get their body's core temperature to 101.3.
Interesting.
Now,
And remember, on the chart, we're finding it at about 45 minutes. Yeah.
Yes. So you can lay down on a bed under a bunch of lamps and say, okay, heat me up here.
You do all the work, though.
That's
Because I'm not going to do any of
Right.
it.
And you can elevate your core temperature to 101.3, and then once we hit that temperature, we turn the lamp off and you cool down. And people with major mood disorder, okay, and that's there's various indices for depression.
Yeah.
One of them is a Hamilton index, another is a Beck depression score. There's several different measures, right, that are gold standard. Found after one session under the heat lamp, found on average, a 5-day effect of a reduced level of depression. And what they found was that, and they were trying to prove this theory on the serotonin production and the heat lamp on the skin. And so imagine you can choose to then, hey, maybe I'll get a heat box and heat lamp and I'll lie down and wait 100 minutes
Right.
for me to trigger that. Or again, go into a hot yoga room and get compounded benefits.
Right, and I think these compounded benefits you're referring to are increased joint mobilization and increased muscle tone and all the other stuff that we do
Yes.
instead of just lying there in front of a really bright lamp.
That's right. So that was really fascinating. So that further reinforced the idea of sauna therapy and heat therapy for major mood disorders, for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. Okay, so in terms of cardiovascular disease, one of the things we were looking at with Pure Action when we were still doing research with Dr. Hunter was metabolic function, particularly endothelial function.
Yeah.
Right, so this may be a good segue tangent into endothelial function. So cardiovascular disease is the number 1 leading cause of death in the United States. Number 1 is cardiovascular disease, or CVD, which includes a multitude of risk factors.
Complications,
Complications.
yeah.
Number 2 is cancer. Okay. So by far, and they're very close, okay, but by far cardiovascular disease is number 1 versus other kinds of non-cancer types of afflictions. And cardiovascular disease sneaks up on you. It's one of those things where by the time you have a heart attack, there have been many choices that you've made in your life,
Sure.
as well as many habits that you've ingrained that have led to that, right? So many, we know, smoking and, whatever, all the kinds of different risk factors that you have, right? Hypertension, things that are visible. What's invisible is endothelial function,
Yeah.
okay? The stiffness of arteries, those are things that you just don't go into the doctor and say, hey, how stiff are my arteries, right? So it's something that sneaks up on you, right? You'll see the symptoms, you won't really see the actual underlying mechanism that's causing the symptoms.
Sure. And then I remember, and just really quickly, I think she was saying that the results that she found were that like just the movement of the blood through the vessels will stimulate the endothelial cells. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah.
They call it a shearing effect.
Oh, yeah. Now, we talk about shearing effect in the vertebral column, which we do not want, but a shearing effect in the vessels is
what you do want.
Good.
Yes. So inside the blood vessels, the arteries, are a muscle layer, the endothelial layer.
Yep.
That endothelial layer is very important to contract the arteries, contract to constrict and to dilate. Constrict and dilate. And proper functioning arteries or healthy arteries can constrict and dilate on the order of about anywhere from 6 to 10% of its diameter.
Okay.
Something along those lines. Don't quote me on that, but it's about right.
And I think depending on the diameter of the vessel itself, it could be the artery, which is the diameter of a quarter, or it could be microscopic. So it's I don't know if that percentage changes based on
the artery. Yes, it sure does. Now, when I say maybe the 6 to 10 is a healthy artery, is the brachial artery.
Okay.
Okay,
So
at
that's
least
one example.
That's one
Got it.
example. So the idea is because that's the easiest artery to measure.
Okay.
Okay, so now is that an indication of aortic stiffness, carotid artery stiffness?
Right.
I don't know. Okay, but the gold standard for in scientific labs, in research labs, is to measure the brachial artery distensibility or compliance, or its ability to contract and dilate. Okay, on the order of 6 to 10% of the diameter is a very healthy artery. Below 4 is like that's you got some warning signs here. You got to be careful. Okay. So that's like maybe indicative of other corresponding arteries or general arterial function. So that's one measure of arterial function. So looking for endothelial function, or the effectiveness of the inner muscular layer that lines your arteries, is of significant research. There's a lot of research being done on that. And what can stimulate the constriction and vasodilation.
Yeah.
So the discovery of nitric oxide and how nitric oxide
Right. I remember it. Yeah.
influences this.
Not nitrous oxide, nitric oxide.
Nitric oxide. Yes, so that is NO. NO is a compound that is very important as a vasodilator. So as a vasodilator, what often happens is that people with poor diet, excess sugar, simple sugar, develop insulin resistance, right? And insulin is a vasoconstrictor.
Okay.
There are certain compounds that are vasoconstrictors that are imbalanced with people with type 2 diabetes. So if you have vasoconstrictors, 5 of them, and only 2 dilators, you're not in balance.
Sure.
So you want your arteries to have, your endothelial cells to have a balance of the constrictors and dilators for them to properly do their job and squeeze, contract and dilate, contract and dilate.
Yep.
So nitric oxide is a vasodilator. So there has been gajillions of dollars expended in the drug industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and there's some good things that come out of that on vasodilators. Those are our blood thinners.
Yeah, exactly.
Our statins, our ED medications. Those are the byproduct, okay, of, they're like, wow, vasodilation has this other effect, okay? That's nitric oxide at work.
Yeah.
At work. So how can we naturally produce nitric oxide, okay? How do we do that? Well, I think that a byproduct, this is me talking, not a scientist talking.
Right.
So if I am in the yoga room as a teacher, back to that, notice your heart rate. Why is it climbing? It is still feeding your brain because our body is like a radiator. It is trying to dissipate heat, move heat out of your body. So all of the vasodilation that is occurring as a response to the heat and our ability to thermoregulate, now you're like that hormetic response. It's like we're pushing your body to the limit. We're revving the engine of the car to 6,000 RPM. Right?
Because if you never get to the 6,000, maybe the components of the car will lose their ability to do it. It's the use it or lose it.
Use it or lose
factor,
it.
Right?
Exactly. So now we start to use it. Now we use the body's biochemistry, the body's ability to withstand and to thermoregulate. It wants to thermoregulate.
Right,
It's been
right.
evolved over millions of years, maybe, to be able to thermoregulate. Another great. So that's what I say in a yoga class.
Yeah.
And
So what I'm hearing is you take some of the components of some of the studies that you're very familiar with, and then you can make assumptions based on those.
Yes.
But and there may not be a specific study that say that, but you're using the individual components.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So it means then getting knowledge, familiar to whatever proficiency that you can speak to it about,
Yeah.
so that if somebody does question you after the class, you can give them a sound answer.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
If you're not convinced, check out this study by so-and-so and so.
Sure.
This is where I've made drew those conclusions on. So it's not all of a sudden that, oh yeah, chin to chest is going to stimulate your thyroid, your parathyroid. No. Now, I might say that sometimes, okay?
Yeah.
But
And that's like there may be some logic there. There might be. And again, that's drawing it's doing the same thing essentially. It's drawing creating some assumptions based on some loose sort of arbitrary information. But just, I think the message that I'm trying to get across is to encourage people to go out and do some research, and not just because you heard it once from some teacher somewhere, it's now suddenly part of your teaching.
Yes. And I don't know how you cover this in your course, but the idea of regulating body heat. Other, and again, I love Dr. Ray Zong. He talks about the evolution of humans and our feet. And he said our feet are one of the most amazing products of evolution.
Yeah.
Because we have the ability to outrun any other animal on this planet.
Really?
And that statement is interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly we cannot outrun a cheetah. But many hunter-gatherer clans or tribes would run and chase the buffalo.
Yeah.
Okay? And then the buffalo would be like, all these people outnumbering me, they got a bunch of weapons and clubs and spears and stuff, and then buffalo runs. But the buffalo cannot thermoregulate.
Oh, interesting.
So the buffalo has to stop, pant, catch their breath.
Got it.
And we can just kind of go and run and keep up. I can see them.
Yeah.
Right? That's why I'm upright. And I can
Yeah.
run with these magical feet.
Magical feet.
And then the buffalo turns around and sees us, and it keeps running. At some point, that buffalo just can't keep up, and they've overheated, and they just fall down.
Interesting.
And then now I can just take my,
and there you go.
and there it is, dinner.
You outran them.
I outran
because
them.
because of endurance.
Because of the ability to thermoregulate like no other animal, and the ability of my feet to outrun.
Very cool.
Okay, so his whole, I'm watching this lecture by Ray Zong, I was like, amazing. So think about that in the study of the human body.
Yeah.
In terms of our anatomy. And so why our feet are so important, and then hence our knees, our hips, our boots.
The vertical vertebral spine,
Yes.
Yeah.
All of that.
All of it.
So that should just open the eyes to
Yes.
wow, what are we doing in this class that is supporting what it is that I have been designed to do?
Yeah.
thermoregulate, and run.
And pushing limits, I'm
Pushing
hearing you say
limits.
also, you know?
Yeah.
And you started this conversation with, you know, perception, you know, and perception of your whatever it is, cardiac output, you know, caloric expenditure, whatever it is, but
Yeah.
your perception of it, and I feel like the heat has such an effect on our perception of what we're doing as well.
Yeah. So then the last study I think that's interesting to talk about. Oh, actually, did we finish the talk about the endothelial function? We did
Brachial,
not.
yeah.
The brachial, yeah. So the brachial artery is a good indicator of our overall endothelial function, right? And so it's measured by cuffing the arm for 5 minutes with a blood pressure cuff.
Mhm.
And so you'll feel a tremendous amount of blood building up.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay? It's like a tourniquet effect, if you will, right? Where we constrict the blood flow to one or more parts of the body. And then when you release the cuff, and there's an ultrasound that's placed on your brachial artery so they can look and take a video of your artery, and with the right equipment, you can see how much the artery, you know, vasodilates
Sure.
and constricts. And when that blood cuff is that cuff is released from the arm, there are the shearing forces. Okay, so the shearing forces stimulate the nitric oxide production, which causes the artery to expand and contract. Okay, so a good healthy artery is going to boom, boom, boom,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
push all that blood through, right? So this has been deemed by cardiovascular researchers to be a very highly correlated metric for your endothelial function and your overall risk for cardiovascular disease. So how do we get that number higher, right? How do we get more healthy arteries? Is it the heat, or is it the yoga postures?
Right.
Or is it both? Okay. And at what age do some of these benefits either change or are greatly impacted more than others? The punchline I'll give you is that for middle-aged to older adults, there's a greater impact of yoga postures regardless of the heat variable.
Okay.
In terms of their ability to improve their endothelial function or lower their risk of cardiovascular disease. Because they probably, and my assumption is that maybe they've had more years of lifestyle choices,
Right,
where
right.
they could actually benefit. So their gap between where they are and where they could be is higher.
Yeah.
So whether you're practicing in a hot room or a thermoneutral room, a 70 or 75 degree room, is of less importance because your body has more
Right.
ways to improve.
The accumulation of habits and
Habits,
behaviors
yes.
and lifestyle choices. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
So which is why yoga is great for people of middle to older age, okay? And it's very appropriate, both room temperature and heated yoga. So the room temperature, think about what we're doing there. We are improving blood flow. We are using isometric whole exercise,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
to hold postures. It is creating, there is contraction and relaxation. So there is stimulation of the arteries in that way. It definitely is more so in a hot room. Okay, so the impact will be greater.
Yeah. So all those are amplified.
They're
The
amplified,
results are all amplified.
for sure. Now, in younger people, and I think the cutoff on this study was like 40, right? So there maybe is less of a delta, right,
Okay,
between
sure.
before and then. So maybe not statistically significant, but maybe close to it. But so we also have to, as in scientists, good scientists will also understand the limitations and admit where maybe it's inconclusive, right? But at the same time, we just say, well, how do you feel?
Right.
Right? How do you feel?
at the end of the day, it is like anecdotally
Yeah.
how you're feeling and
Yeah.
how this is impacting your life.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Jeff.
No, thank you. That was fun. I could talk forever.
I know. I was like, wow, he's still going.
Somebody stop me.
Somebody stop me.